would like to acknowledge that this church service is taking place on the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay people and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. At our food pantry last week, one of our regulars, Molly, said to me loudly as she pulled up on her bike, "I'm glad this pandemic happened." I asked why, and she said, "Because for the first time, everyone feels like homeless people feel all the time." I said, "How's that, Molly?" And she said, "Powerless. Powerless." It struck me and it stopped me. It gave me a split-second insight into what life is like for Molly and all our homeless neighbors all the time. For once, Molly felt like all of society was having a moment of temporary understanding of her plight, even if they didn't recognize it as such. I don't know about you, but I certainly felt powerless as the news of the pandemic broke. Here's this new virus that the medical community knows nothing about, and there's no cure, and people are dying by the hundreds of thousands. That's a powerless feeling. The disciples also felt powerless, I think, in the boat tossed about on the angry sea. They must have been terrified all night as the storm raged and the winds howled. And I imagine Joseph felt powerless at the bottom of the pit awaiting the slave traders who hauled him off to Egypt. Jacob had sent his favorite son, his youngest, Joseph, to check on the well-being of his older brothers. And the word that's used in Hebrew for that word well-being is actually shalom, which we know means peace. Go, check on the peace of your brothers, Joseph. And so he does. But when he finds them, he does not find peace, but jealousy, cruelty, and violence. We are so quick, aren't we, to move to violence when we feel threatened. The families that we've been hearing about in Genesis these past weeks and months are steeped in scarcity mentality. Us versus them. In order for me to thrive, you have to have nothing at all, or just not even exist. Remember Sarah and Hagar? Sarah had Hagar tossed into the desert with nothing except her son, because she felt worried about her own son. And Jacob stole the birthright and privilege from his brother Esau through trickery. And Cain killed Abel because he felt jealous of Abel's burnt offering. So from the beginning of time, we have struggled to trust in the abundance of enough, having enough, being enough. The ancient Israelites were also a kinship society, which means both that your whole identity is rooted in your family, and you exist to serve your family and to bring glory and honor to the family, and also that your family is your one safe place in the world where you always belong, no matter what. So for Joseph's own brothers to treat him this way was deeply painful and wrong. This summer, white people have seen a bit of the betrayal that people of color experience in this country that claims to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. This place where people of color were born and DACA dreamers were raised. This place betrays you if you're a person of color. The system is against you. You cannot get ahead. In fact, you may even lose your life in broad daylight on a busy city street at the hands of a police officer, a peace officer. The brothers in the Genesis story betray Joseph. And what do they say as he approaches? "Here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." Joseph's brothers are fighting over favor and birthright, believing there's an us and a them, and that there's not enough to go around. How quickly their thinking leads them to violence. At first they want to kill Joseph, but then they decide through some strange moral calculus that enslavement is better. "Here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." Those words are carved into a plaque outside the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. The motel is now a civil rights museum that I visited a few years ago. It is eerie to walk right up to the room where Dr. King stayed when he gave his final mountaintop speech. The room is perfectly preserved, as though Dr. King had just stepped out on the balcony to visit with his friends below when the bullet struck him in the back of his neck. The room is perfectly preserved, But the dream of Dr. King, well, they killed him. And what has become of his dream? That people can join hands regardless of skin color, and that people be judged by the content of the character, not the color of their skin. We may have passed the Civil Rights Act, but we still have a long way to go. What has become of the dream of Dr. King? In our gospel today, Peter is a mixture of fear and faith. He's got the confidence to step out of the boat onto the stormy sea, but then he sees the wind whipping up all around and he loses focus and he begins to sink. He thinks he can handle it. He thinks he knows what to do, what to say, and he has faith enough to take a step, but his fear overcomes him in the same instant. Isn't that like those of us who have had all the privileges of whiteness? We are here, possibly wanting to step out into the chaos that people of color live with every day of their lives. We want to understand, to connect, to somehow right the wrongs of the past. And we may think ourselves brave and capable of handling a bit of chaos. But when we actually take those steps, and we really experience the chaos, the injustice, the racist aggressions, it's infuriating and overwhelming. And we may falter and sink. But Jesus is there, holding out a hand, ready to steady us and help us on the walk. Learning about injustice in the world, injustice that we may have been implicitly supporting and benefiting from, can stir up huge feelings of shame and guilt. It's not easy. But learn to be in the chaos and to reach out for support. Don't get lost in the shame and the guilt. Keep going. In the Sacred Ground small groups at St. Mark's, groups that are working through a film and reading-based curriculum on racism, Leonard Pitts Jr., an African-American commentator, said this: "Understand that this is sacred ground and that it hurts to walk here. But at the same time, I need to walk here, need the strength, the sense of purpose, the knowledge of self that walking here imparts. What do I want from you? I want you to be my sister and to walk here with me. I know it's a hard walk. I know it causes you pain. But this much I also know. If ever we learn to tread this ground together, there's no place we can't go." If we can get out of the boat with Peter and just have humility and courage and faith, to have all of those at the same time, maybe we can make progress toward a more equitable society. The Reverend Rebecca Parker says, "My commitment to racial justice is both on behalf of the other, my neighbor, whose well-being I desire, and for myself, to whom the gift of life has been given, but not yet fully claimed." Jesus tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Perhaps we aren't good at loving our neighbors because we aren't good at loving ourselves, or at letting in the love of God. Grappling with race and racism is deeply healing for white people as well as people of color. I read an article about how the mayor of Istanbul won his election, and he won by a landslide. And his campaign was based on radical love. That was the name of it. He never said anything negative about his opponent, and he took the high road. His messages were all ones of inclusiveness, an attitude of respect toward the opponent's supporters. He spent time listening to them and making clear they weren't the enemy, a real focus on compassion-based bread and butter issues that united voters. I bring this up with the knowledge that rooting social change in love is not in any way new. It's the basis of all nonviolent movements. Ruby Sales, theologian and civil rights activist, talks about the spiritual depths of people who have been enslaved. And this became the grounds for the civil rights movement. This is how she described it: that these enslaved people brought forth radical love out of the toxic virus of hate. And the song she describes that epitomizes this, the words are, "I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart. And you can't make me hate you. You can't make me hate you in my heart." Krista Tippett interviewed Congressman John Lewis a few years ago. Beautiful interview. I highly recommend it. And it has that same energy of radical love. He says, When we were sitting in, it was love in action. When we were on the Freedom Line ride, it was love in action. The march from Selma to Montgomery was love in action. We do it not simply because it's the right thing to do. It's love in action. This is radical love. But this is interesting. He points out in this that it takes training to bring it out of us. We can't cultivate radical love unless we're intentional. In the 60s, he describes this outward training of radical love, how to be at the protests for those who are going to engage in nonviolence, how to stay respectful and friendly toward everyone, including those violating them. They would actually role play getting violated, getting kicked and beat up and spit on. And they had this training to keep looking someone in the eye who was beating them and to say, I'm human, you're human. That's powerful. That's the power of being a Christian and of learning to see the spark of the divine in everyone, learning how not to give up on anyone, even your oppressor. You learn how to weather the storms and navigate the chaos, always staying near Jesus, ready to grab hold of the one who is love if you should falter and begin to sink. How are you going to step out of the boat in faith this week?